Hello, welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you so much, Robin, for your opening talk. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. Welcome to everyone. Hello, I am Sarah. I'm the founder of a strategic design company called Projects by If. We work on trust, specifically how trust is reinforced in technology, decisions, and products. And we do that work because, like many of you here today, we believe that technology has a trust problem that needs fixing. And at If, we work with our clients across big tech like Google, plus regulators, governments, to reduce that trust gap through design. Alongside my work as founding CEO at If, I also help a urban planning product startup called Diagonal that uses privacy preserving technology. And I also sit on the Mayor of London's Data for London Advisory Board. I started If in 2016. And while it only feels like yesterday, a lot has changed in technology and regulation. But something that feels really familiar to me is this recent shift we're seeing in the work of trust, ethics, privacy, insert all the words in that space, is moving from kind of the responsible innovation teams back into product and compliance teams. And as Robin was speaking to earlier, privacy is a product problem to be solved. And while many of us want to do the right thing with data, with privacy, not many of us know how just yet. And so I'm really excited to get into this panel conversation this afternoon to get into that a bit more, because we are here to discuss the realities of putting privacy and data ethics into practice. And we have got an exceptionally good panel of people, all of you who I'm lucky to call co-conspirators and friends. And I have the pleasure of introducing them now. So in alphabetical order, we've got Amy. Amy spent 20 years in consulting for Fortune 500 companies before switching to the nonprofit sector. I met her as design director for Simply Secure, they're now called Superbloom, where she created human-centered design practices focused on privacy, security, and transparency. And now she focuses on external partnerships to alter who technology serves. Next up, we have Diana, who is Sky's data ethics lead. She's working to bring data ethics and responsibility to the fore and encouraging ethical data use across Sky. She's also co-chair of the Digital Ethics Network with a decade of experience across corporate innovation, tech advocacy, and IT strategy consulting. Elaine, hi Elaine. She's design director at Meta in Seattle, and she leads privacy design and co-leads Meta's Trust, Transparency and Control Labs. One of the Trust, Transparency, Control Labs priorities is privacy and safety for young people. And they focused a large part of their work consulting and co-designing with policymakers, regulators, NGOs, parents and guardians, and teens. It's a lot of people over the last 5 years. Excited to hear more. And Nathan, last but not least, is CEO and co-founder of App Census and founder of Good Research, and he also lectures at UC Berkeley's iSchool. He provides technical assurances of privacy tech, including motivated intruder testing, app privacy analysis, and system and process analysis too. We have got a lot of expertise in this room right now. So please do, those of you who are joining us, write any questions that you have for our panelists in the chat bar on this website page. And we're going to filter those. Kenneth is behind the scenes helping to filter them too. And I'll be bringing your questions to the panelists about halfway through our time together. And I'm going to kick us off with some questions I'm keen to ask to begin with. So let's get into it. So I'd love to turn to you first, Nathan, because I know that at Good Research, you have this really awesome framework to think about privacy in product as policies, promises, and practices. I'd love to hear more about how you use that in your work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. It's such a privilege to be here with all these experts, and looking forward to fielding all the questions from the audience. One of the things that we found in working with privacy in practice over the past 12 years is that it seems deceptively easy, because all of us have an intuition about how this should work. It feels, in many cases, I remember very early, people saying, well, it's just common sense. You know, we kind of know, we care about our users, we care very deeply about our users. And therefore, you know, we as an organization, we understand implicitly how to solve a privacy problem in practice. In reality, these become very, very tricky. And what we've noticed is that the reason they become tricky is because there's multiple factors and multiple stakeholders that really are involved in this. And the framework that we use to talk about this is thinking about it from a perspective of promises that you give your users, the practices that you implement in your organization, and then how that aligns with policies, which that includes both regulations and your internal policies. And so if we start first with this notion of promises encompass a vast amount of communication, including the notions that Robin was talking about earlier of trust. It's your user experience is your privacy policy, as Woody Hartzog likes to say. Your product is your privacy policy. The actual documents that you provide to people, the contracts that you have in place, that entire user experience is really what users understand and about the promises that you're making about your privacy assurances. The next thing that you need to do is you need to align the practices that you have in place with that. The practices are the actions that fulfill these promises. They're the technical implementations that you have behind the scenes, both things that a user would see or would not see. It's how you engage with policy considerations and regulations, and it's how you put all of this into work. And it's a tremendous amount of effort that has to align with these promises. The third part of this that this all has to align with is the policies or regulations. And these regulations sometimes can be difficult to interpret and difficult to understand. And you need to both interpret those, align those with your practices, make sure that you're promising the things. And that's why this three-legged stool of promises, practices, and policies is how we look at solving a privacy problem and adjusting that tech and those actions in order to make it work. And because it has three legs opposed to just, you know, fulfilling sort of a policy requirement, that's what makes it really tricky. That's where it's really important to have a good understanding of user expectations and the context so that you're designing these practices, aligning these policies, and making the right promises for people.
So important, and I think also speaks to some of this like interdependencies and complexity that Robin was talking about earlier. And I know that Diana, you would argue that there's possibly like a fourth leg to this stool that's perhaps needs to be added to this, which is, you know, your experience building communities of practice within Sky. How do we get these multidisciplinary teams together to take action on privacy practically within organizations? I'd love to know what you've learned most recently about bringing together community of practices at Sky around data ethics to perhaps suggest that fourth leg to the stool that Nathan has so articulately shaped for us.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everybody who've joined us today. It's really lovely to be here. Before I assumed my post as data ethics lead, I really thought of data ethics as a primarily technical and ethical problem. And since having joined Sky, I've learned so much about the need for adequate governance structures to be put in place in order to drive any kind of ethical data transformation. And I think optimal governance can take many guises. It can mean having an interdisciplinary governance boards focused on data ethics. It can mean launching working groups focused around specific risk areas. So I think I heard AI governance working groups are very popular these days. They can also be focused around product features that are particularly innovative or haven't been widely tested. Or it could just mean that there need to be more representatives joining existing governance and data forums. But I think outside of and aside from all of these different governance structures, I really see internal communities as one of the key initiators of organizational change. So at Sky, I co-chair the Digital Ethics Network, which is a network of volunteers, over around 150, some more active than others, and they're all really passionate about bringing ethical thinking and design to the use of data and tech. We've had an internal event yesterday attended by a good number of people, over 100, and we talked about the role that each individual has to play in designing ethical products. So I'll share some high-level takeaways from that experience. They won't be as catchy as the 3 Ps from Nathan, but I hope nevertheless still somewhat insightful. So in order to have a community of practice, I think first thing it's key to identify people who can drive and co-create privacy-focused initiatives. Within Sky, these individuals would mainly sit within design and product, predominantly because they're aware of the product roadmap, they're familiar with ways of working and decision-making within their respective directorates. And I think within a community, not everyone has to be a driver. Some people can support by awareness raising, reviewing frameworks, bringing use cases to the group, but it's crucial to identify these key leading advocates. Second thing that I've learned throughout the past year and a half is to balance the business needs with aspirations of that same community. So in order to find out what works well, as far as different ethical and privacy-focused initiatives, we applied a bit of an innovation framework in the vein of design, test, repeat, reiterate. So we've defined pilots with some of the key advocates, took it to the relevant sponsor or lead or exec, got their feedback, and through that process, we've grown some internal knowledge of what optimal privacy-focused initiatives might look like, and got really good feedback on what there is appetite for within the business. And I think, what's been really inspiring for me and some of the fiercest advocates that I've met in my post were people who are already plugged into some of the external data ethics and privacy-focused communities. So those could be, machine learning engineers who've done a part-time master's in ethics or mission-driven grads. And being able to nourish those individuals and inspire them, I think will take you quite a long, will basically reap the benefits and will help you grow a community of practice that's effective, but also really strong.
No, I love that. Thank you. And I think a word that both you and Nathan are both bringing up there is this word intuition. And I think for those of us on the call here in the panel, I mean, I'm speaking for all of us now, but I think that sense of, my friend Alex Dunn talks about technical intuition that you need to do this work. And so there are so many processes that you can set out and design, but of course, ultimately, it's the people who will be doing the work, making the decisions. And in order to bring privacy practically into your work in product, to some extent, you need to be living and breathing this. You need to have some of those intuitive moments when you're designing or making product priority decisions to guide how you make decisions to drive towards the right outcomes for privacy, for people, for your users. So I really, really appreciate that. And speaking about that intuition point, I'd love to turn the mic to Amy at this point, to your work at Superbloom, and particularly the communities that you've been working with, who we've just spoken about internal communities. I know that at Superbloom you work with communities of designers, engineers, product people from across different organizations to implement privacy more effectively. And I'd love to hear more about some of that work and what you're hearing, where the kind of challenges and opportunities are within multidisciplinary communities from across different organizations. I know you've done some really interesting work recently on kind of cookie banners in particular. So I'd love to learn more about what you're seeing there.
Thank you, Sarah. So I identify as a practitioner, a user experience researcher, and designer. And one of the projects that we at Superbloom did was a small scale kind of qualitative study of front-end designers and developers tasked with implementing cookie banners. And much of what we heard is similar to the points that Robin made in the keynote. There was an incredible sense of isolation that we heard about the person doing this feeling like they were alone, We heard a lot about liability avoiders that were driven totally by fear of punishment. And there's a real kind of vacuum of creating privacy positive experiences that are compelling, that making kind of digital experiences that people want to spend time in. At Superbloom, we offer support for practitioners who are interested in these issues. One of the current manifestations of that is a Slack that people are able to join. We have a knowledge base online, and a lot of my work is really trying to help design professionals get the kind of basics of privacy and some of these issues so that they can bring that into their own teams and into their own work. I see professional education as an essential part. That could be in conferences. There's IXDA, there's privacy associations. These are essential tools for helping the practitioners that are actually doing this work. And we're keen to support that. And at Superbloom, we have a portfolio of projects called From Policy to Pixels that's really looking at that transition. And we are happy to convene people to discuss these issues further.
Thank you. I think we're adding to our P's framework just now, from policies, promises, practices, pixels. How many more P's can we get in? No, thank you so much. And I'm part of that Superbloom Slack community, and can recommend it for those of you who may not be there already. Other Slack communities are obviously available, I should probably be saying, but I do rate that one. So my final kickoff question to the panel, and then also just a reminder to our audience, questions you'd like me to ask, please pop them in the chat. We've got about 15 minutes and then I will be turning to your questions. So please do type into that chat box. I'd love to obviously go to Elaine to really build on the opinions of the panel so far. And I'd love to learn more about the challenges that you've overcome in implementing privacy for the long term, particularly in your role with Trust, Transparency Control Labs at Meta. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, panel, for all your wonderful thoughts so far, and Sarah for moderating. You'll probably hear some similar words around intuition and moving from policy to pixels, and that privacy really is a product problem, one of the things that I'm going to talk about. So the question there is, implementing privacy over the long term at Meta. We, of course, have the challenge of scale. We're already serving billions of people with products, and new or updated products are rolling out every week across our family of apps globally. So our first challenge is really ensuring that product makers have the tools and standards and guidance to make those everyday product decisions, that sort of intuitive decisions. I can't be everywhere, our privacy team can't be everywhere, so we need to make sure that these tools and guides are really paramount to that long-term success, whether that be kind of a mandatory training that everyone has to do, toolkits, shared engineering infra where people can pull directly from code, written guidelines, or more, ensuring these are really up to date with all of the different things that we need to think about, privacy, safety, well-being, security, even competition regulation, to name a few now, are sort of built into the workflows for product makers and just really accessible to all of them in their regular everyday work. It doesn't help to just have these moments of training. It needs to be there all the time. For Meta, it's really an entire size of a regular company to scale this work to all of our product makers, engineers, designers, data scientists, product managers, and more to deliver on it. So on a similar vein, another challenge that we have of sort of long-term success is that in practice, privacy is just one consideration that we need to take into account. as you know. There are other different stakeholders that really are looking at solutions for our products and other products on the internet through very, very different lenses. And that can be especially highlighted for youth, where privacy, safety, and well-being are clearly completely intertwined. Approaches can really vary very widely globally, which can have real implications on feature availability, ways that we think about privacy, safety, well-being, defaults, sequencing of flows, to name a few. And we have to balance all of these considerations and take a global, holistic approach. So let me give you a couple of examples when we're thinking about youth. With parental supervision, it's not called for in all regulation. Like, the safety community can look at it as a tool for parents, but privacy advocates may have real concerns about gathering information that can really infringe on teens' right to privacy. Or another really good example is when you think about, understanding the age of a user is really important to give age-appropriate experiences, but asking for that age can't be overly intrusive. Or have high data collection, especially for young people. So as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, we spent a lot of time at Meta and TTC Labs, really trying to bring together that global discourse, bringing together policymakers and designers, academics, NGOs, and everyone else who wants to join, to focus on these kind of shared ideas. And, one of the things that always comes to me, having focused on youth privacy specifically for a while, is especially in the age-appropriate design code, is that best interest of the child being really paramount. That primary motivation is definitely something that designers and regulators, and I'm sure everyone around the world, are really motivated to collaborate on. So I'm really excited to hear more from the panel and hear more questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elaine. And, so we've got at the moment from the panel this kind of need for technical intuition, from policies to pixels, that privacy is a product problem. We've also got the sense of the kind of guidelines we might need to navigate this space beyond the kind of waves of regulation, but also how contextually specific the privacy work is that we need to be doing. So yeah, love all of this. And to add just another component in, Amy, at Superbloom, I know that the work often focuses on the kind of practitioners in the work and building that technical intuition and muscle. And I'd love to just hear more, if you could tell us about some of the initiatives that have really worked to create that sense of shared understanding about what best practice looks like or could look like.
Unmute. Thank you. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is building better onboarding experiences. So through our partnerships with things like the Open Tech Fund and their kind of security and usability programs, there's some really exciting stuff happening in the open source community, building alternatives to some of the main tech platforms. But a lot of these have a really high technical burden, and there is a really kind of interesting opportunity in helping mainstream users get on board with things like, for example, decentralized systems. And I am pleased to see that there is kind of a building and growing curiosity about how some of these infrastructure pieces work. Looking at changes in the Twitter ecosystem, for example, I've seen an uptick in people asking, well, what is an API, and why does that matter? And I'm glad to try to connect designers, but also people who are advocating for kind of the end user experience more generally.
Yeah, it's something that Diana, Nathan, and I were discussing just yesterday, some of how these kind of events across the kind of technology ecosystem, like Chat GTP, for example, begins to create kind of hype or wave of interest that can bring more people into this space and kind of raise awareness and continue to change the overall interest that we have. Nathan, I wondered if you had anything else that you'd like to share from your work in terms of what it means to give practitioners the kinds of tools to make some of these more contextually specific decisions about when privacy is most appropriate to apply across some of these other wider issues that Elaine was talking about earlier, the kind of wider issues around like safety, trust, and that we seem to be adding into what it means to build better technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite quotations is, trust walks in on foot and runs out on horseback. And I think it's one of these things that when you lose it, you've lost it. But it's hard to understand what are the various different components that actually make it up. And if we think about how that aligns with the notion of privacy, I think it is very complex because privacy can be very contextual. The way that we see it work in practice is that it breaks down into a couple different categories. There are certain legal obligations, depending on the vertical that you are in, that are somewhat well understood from a compliance framework that you need to be doing. So, for example, if you're in the medical space, there's protection of health information. If you're in the advertising space, there's somewhat an understanding of personal information and personal identifiers. And then I think outside of that is you start to move into a question of, what are consumers' expectations about their privacy and how does that refer to context? I think that's where people get tripped up quite a bit because they don't quite have the tools to understand it or even to measure it very well. So, for example, one of the things that we like to look at is a set of metrics around, reluctance, resentment, and regret that we pull together. So regret looks at, okay, would I change my mind in this situation based off of new knowledge if I really understood this? And so you can use that as a way of aligning expectations. Reluctance is a really other good one. Reluctance we sort of measure as, because privacy can be this latent concern that has large impact on trust in some cases, people can be hitting all their metrics. They can be saying, oh yeah, our onboarding is great, everything's working well, but the way that you're interfacing with the user is building a sense of resentment and reluctance, and then we have an opportunity to stick it to you, they will. And so I think there's a framing of how we look at understanding users' expectations that fortunately a lot of product people already have some of the basic tools from their UX toolkit of doing interviews and doing surveys, and just being able to incorporate that mindset can help people better understand the context, the contextual side of privacy that can be so nuanced yet so important when we're designing product.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to, I love that. And I also really appreciate how you just blended in speaking about metrics, which was one of the questions from the audience, like a really important one. How do we make this measurable, actionable? So thank you so much, Nathan. I'm going to go to some of the questions that have come in from our audience. Thank you so much for them. And the one that I'd like to go to first, and I wondered, Elaine, whether you might like to kick us off on this one, which is our audience members asked, since access to real data and research is expensive for small teams and just compliance isn't enough, how can a lean product team work to offer the best ethical and privacy respectful experience?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, of course, at Meta we have a lot of very talented practitioners and ways in which we can do research, as was mentioned by Nathan. Of course, interviews and surveys, co-design with users and things like that. What you'll find is, oftentimes we don't have to go very far to really understand users' expectations, because we are all folks who use products. We all have opinions. We all have maybe children or any other family members that we need to support in using different services. So obviously in a more lean product setting, you can still do this kind of co-design in particular, and of course interviewing friends and family or adjacent people in your company. Maybe you're working in the design or product focus or technical parts of the company, and maybe there's another area in the company that is not so ingrained in all the engineering and technical aspects of your products. Go and ask them some questions around privacy and well-being and safety around your products. And of course, if you have the opportunity, not just ask them questions, but actually ask them to co-design with you, because what you develop when you're actually giving the pen to someone else in terms of how they would solve that problem, that's when you really uncover some of the really exciting and innovative ways that we can think about, being able to meet people's expectations and not just create yet another thing that's blocking someone from getting to the services that they want. So inviting people to be part of the development of your product. And again, specifically talking to people who are going to have very different perspective. Of course, we had a much larger co-design program across multiple countries and with regulators as well, but you could do that on a much smaller scale. So when we were talking to teens, we were also at the same time talking to parents and guardians or people who looked after children to understand, well, what was good for them? What was great for them? How would they design that kind of dashboard of settings or ways to help their teen? And then on the conversely, what would the teen find acceptable? Because as we know, if any of you have teens, they're fickle creatures who you may not expect what they're going to say. And you find like really interesting crossovers when you actually co-design with people that you know are going to have very different points of view. So again, back to the original question, lean teams, you don't have to go too far even within your company or even with friends and family to get them involved in thinking about how to approach your product.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. And I really love how what's coming through really strongly as well for me here is like just taking a really human-centered approach to these issues, like humanize them, make them simpler where possible, because we are all at the end of the day people who use technology and experience these kinds of privacy questions or concerns. So I'd love, Diana, if you'd like to kind of build on what Elaine was speaking to from your perspective, that would be brilliant to understand more from you.
Thanks, Sarah. I really, really liked what Elaine was saying, and actually quite a lot of it resonated with me when she talked about, kind of that customer user-focused design, and with that, this customer research and co-creation of what good privacy practices look like. And I think, what we found is that the knowledge of and the ability to really understand the different facets of customer trust is so important. And I think in this growing field of data ethics, there's this, I think, accepted argument that responsible data practices, including greater transparency into the way customer data is being used and analyzed, is going to build customer trust. And I completely agree with that. I support that. I advocate for it. But it does hinge on the ability of practitioners to appreciate the nuances of trust. And I think within that, first off, being able to understand what builds trust for the company and the sector is something that any kind of privacy advocate or any lean product team should know. Secondly, we talk about customer trust, but actually within that notion, there's difference between customer behaviors, customer purchasing decisions, what drives customers' willingness to share data, and what informs their perception of company versus competitors. So actually being able to draw on some of that understanding would be so helpful in understanding then how to design for optimal customer experience. And I think, again, kind of understanding different ways in which privacy decisions manifest themselves and are perceived by customers would probably be the third part to that story. So what aspects of data practices, what aspects of privacy do customers feel most troubled by and are likely to lead to things like customer churn or loss of trust? Or on the other hand, what data practices might lead to increased product scale or improved brand preference? So arguably that is quite a lot of research for a small team, but I think that should be the starting point, and actually having that strong understanding of trust as a multifaceted issue, I think will open many doors and help scale a lot of privacy initiatives.
Thank you. I love that build, and there's a quick plug to some work that we've done that's shared in the open. It's the Responsible Technology by Design framework, which you can find under Medium if you look up Sarah Gold and Responsible Tech by Design framework. We've spoken about some of what we think constitutes a trustworthy product or experience, so do have a look at that if that's helpful to you at all. But zooming back into that privacy lens, I can see our chat behind the scenes kind of kicking off from that question. And I can see that, Amy, you're speaking about also just using like screenshots and like simple ways of gathering information, feedback from people initially is a great way for also to help small teams address privacy. I'd love to hear more about that if you could share.
Sure. This is just a super basic and standard kind of product design tool, which is making some kind of map or a pinup board of screenshotting kind of what each state in an interface is, and looking at how people can move through the experience, what choices are available. That also kind of sets up some groundwork for later discussion in the day about deceptive design, because what things does the interface make easy versus what things does the interface make hard. But for me, I think acknowledging that these cross-functional teams have different strengths, and people that excel in the law are often very comfortable reading extremely dense legalese text, and people who excel in visual design may not be. And I think coming up with appropriate ways for people to share knowledge that center on what do the end users actually see and touch can be helpful for finding common ground.
Yeah, thank you. That kind of common ground piece across these like multidisciplinary teams, where we have to, this work by necessity kind of needs to integrate quite siloed work streams often to be able to make these kind of holistic choices about privacy, product, and so on. So, and I want to come back to this kind of, now we've kind of gone very small about that kind of small scale research, go back out broad again. Last question from the audience, which is, I've seen some global products treat people from different jurisdictions differently. For example, granting people protected by GDPR more rights than people from other regions. Is this a problem, and how can it be solved? My panelists, who would like to pick that question up first?
I'm happy to, unless other
Wonderful.
people want to go first.
Yeah.
Yeah, the jurisdictional issue is real, and people struggle with it in several different ways. And the organizations that we've worked with, for example, there's typically a decision: am I going to try and, if we're thinking about it in terms of what's called like data localization, do I want that data to reside in that locale, or do I want to avail of some kind of safe harbor to transfer it over, and what sort of systems do I need to put in place? That becomes a very complex question, and the way that people what levers they use to kind of think through this question and potentially resolve it are the utility of the data that they're trying to gather, as well as the risk factors that they have involved and the cost in maintaining that. So, I mean, that's just a bunch of sort of high-level ways of saying there's multiple considerations that people are having that they're leveraging. In practice, what we tend to recommend people is just go for the most consumer protective one, and here's why. If we're thinking about it from a strictly practical perspective, then you only have one system you need to maintain and use, and that complies across the broadest the most narrowest interpretation. And then you've future-proofed your system against the types of issues that could come up because regulations are changing rapidly. And places are becoming more strict with data, and you don't have to make a sort of on the dime decision to have to change a major architectural component or data localization. And so we push for that, and personally I believe that's the better way to do it. But some people choose to have two systems, which is their choice, but I think it's kind of a lost opportunity, actually.
Yeah, I think the opportunity there to bring your product into a space where it's not only answering this best practice or regulatory standards really, but really moving towards best practice is an opportunity for new kinds of products and services, but also the customer retention growth that we're speaking about. Elaine, anything you'd like to add there from your work? Very globally.
Yeah, sorry, we're tiny little bit of lag there. I'm in Seattle. So just to accentuate Nathan's point, of course, again, back to the scale of Meta, is that we are looking at that global approach, that we can't just go on a location, region by region set of regulation. We're always looking across what all the different countries, what are the requirements of the recommendation, and it's good. It's good practice, it's good for business, it's all those things when you take a global approach to regulation. Of course, there's going to be some parts that are just a little bit different in terms of even what would be classed in the youth space of what is the age of a young person, when are they no longer youth and they're now adult. That can be different. Of course, we would absolutely take that into account. But our approach to the sort of regulation and thinking about privacy and safety and well-being, we have to take a global approach because we're a global product.
Yeah, and I mean, in the last few years, like the different waves of regulation that are influencing product now is really quite astonishing. Not only, I mean, building from GDPR, but moving forward now into like DMA, DSA, there is so much to keep on top of. So this is just a space that I think we can expect to continue to be regulated. And so using product mindsets and human-centered ways of working to get ahead of that, I think is really the only way that we'll make this a manageable feature, not a bug for organizations to have to work with. So I've absolutely loved talking to all of you today, and just thank you so much to the ICO for inviting me to moderate today. I'd love to end our panel with a reflection point, really, which is something that surprised you or that you learned from the other panelists here today. And we'll end with me, just some quick reflections, and then we'll pass the mic back over to Kenneth. Diana, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to go first, and if you could then pass the mic, just a quick reflection of something interesting that you've learned.
Sure. I really liked Nathan's point, the 3 Ps, because I really liked the promises part. And oftentimes within a large corporation, we talk about promises to customers, but actually there are promises to be made to your fellow employees. And there's that growing notion that actually big corporations do have certain social responsibilities. They are seen as enablers of certain broader social trends. And so I feel like shifting the conversation from privacy as as a compliance issue to privacy as that strengthener of promises, and kind of that kind of broader point around I guess building a better social contract enabled by data and privacy. That to me is a really, really a great ideal, and it's a great framework. And I hope that over time we can all be a part of that broader societal shift.
Thank you. Really beautiful words. I'm going to have to go super quickly. Elaine, do you have like a very fast highlight?
I do. I can't remember who said policy to pixels, but you've just given me the new name for our any kind of internal training or standards. Thanks for that.
I love that. Thank you. Nathan?
I loved Diana's point on community. being a very important part of the process of design, and in considering that larger community, I thought that was really, really helpful.
Thank you so much. And Amy?
I want to say thank you to Elaine and Diana, because when you are in a position where you have actual people at scale coming to use your things and something has to happen, that's a very difficult and different position than being, a theorist who could talk about how things might work in the abstract. So thank you for sharing stories about day-to-day real life.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the generosity of all of the panelists. What I loved so much was really the reminder of just how systemic these opportunities are and challenges, but also really that not only it's about putting people in the focus of your work, but also that this work requires humans and that technical intuition, that sense of community and shared purpose. Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass back over to Kenneth, who has got an announcement to make. Thank you so much.
Brill, thank you so much, Sarah, and all of the panelists. I thought that was a fascinating discussion, and thank you for taking the time to join us. One of the common themes that I've seen in some of the questions that we've had in this panel and also in the previous session is about a desire to put this into practice, particularly in smaller teams. And I think this tees us up actually very nicely, because just before we head into our break, we have a short announcement from us at the ICO. We are committed to working with technologists and firms throughout the UK to try and help you embed privacy in everything that you do. So I'm delighted to announce that today we're publishing new guidance on privacy in the product design lifecycle. And we've written this in consultation with working technologists like yourselves, and it's aimed at product and UX designers, at product managers, software engineers, and it covers each step of the product design and development process, right from ideas and kickoff through research, design, development, all the way through to launch and beyond. We also outlined the case for privacy, and not just about then the need to comply with the law, but also the importance of privacy for people, for societies, and for businesses as well. So that guidance, I'm happy to announce, is live right now at the following URL that you see on screen, ico.org.uk/privacy-design. And we try to make it direct and actionable, and above all, to give you some certainty on what your duties are. So we've structured it to tell you explicitly what you must, should, and could do to address privacy issues right the way through your work. And we also link then to deeper guidance on important topics like designing consent systems, individual rights, and transparency for people who need to go further in that kind of detail. So please, I urge you to read it, refer to it, share it with your colleagues, and we hope that you find that it's useful and practical advice when building your next features and products.